The paramedics took him away on a Tuesday morning while the magnolias were blooming. I stood on the porch and I didn't cry and I didn't understand why until I opened the drawer and found the license with his photograph and someone else's name. 31 years, a house we shared, a bed we shared, children who called him father, friends who called him honorable, and a woman in another state who had spent 2 years filing missing person reports because she thought he was dead. He wasn't dead. He had simply become someone else, and I had loved that someone else with everything I had. The question that kept me awake every night wasn't who he was. It was, who had I been? Standing next to him. The morning Thomas died, the magnolias were in full bloom. Margaret Caldwell stood on the porch of her house on Monument Avenue, a cup of chamomile tea warming her palms, watching the pale pink petals drift down onto the sidewalk like soft confetti celebrating something she didn't yet understand. The air in Richmond that April morning carried the particular heaviness that comes just before a storm, thick, sweet, and electric. She had always loved that feeling as a girl, that sense of the world holding its breath. Now, at 63, it only made her tired. Behind her, through the glass pane of the front door, she could hear the paramedics moving with practiced efficiency through the hallway. Low voices, the creak of a stretcher, the quiet click of a medical bag being snapped shut. Thomas had been gone for nearly 40 minutes by the time they arrived, a massive cardiac event. They told her swift and silent, the kind that offers no warning and no goodbye. He had simply not woken up that Tuesday morning, and the man she had shared her bed with for 31 years was gone. She did not cry. Not then. Not then. That detail would bother her daughter Claire for months afterward, the fact that Margaret had stood on the porch drinking tea while the body of her husband was carried out of the house, but Margaret could not explain it, not in any way that would satisfy someone who had not lived those 31 years. The stillness she felt was not coldness. It was not relief. Exactly. It was something closer to the sensation of finally putting down a very heavy bag that you had been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. Thomas Howard Caldwell had been 68 years old, a retired financial consultant, or so he had always said, a man of deliberate habits. He took his coffee black, read the Richmond Times-Dispatch every morning from front to back, kept his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and never, in 3 decades of marriage, raised his voice. He was the kind of man who received compliments at dinner parties, the kind of man who made other women tell Margaret how lucky she was. She had believed them. For a very long time, she had believed every single word of it. Their house on Monument Avenue was one of the grand old row homes that lined Richmond's most storied boulevard, a 4-story, Victorian with original crown molding, a wraparound porch, and a garden that Margaret tended herself with the kind of devotion other women reserved for grandchildren. She had moved in as a young bride of 32, stepping through the front door for the first time with her whole life arranged in cardboard boxes and her heart full of something that felt, in those days, like certainty. They had met at a charity gala hosted by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Thomas had been 40 years old and recently relocated from Raleigh, North Carolina, or so Saidi. He was tall, lean, impeccably dressed, with silver threading through his dark hair even then, and a way of listening that made you feel as though every word you said was the most interesting thing he had ever heard. Margaret had been cautious by nature. Her mother had raised her that way, in a modest house in the Fan District, with the belief that charm was not the same thing as character. But Thomas had been patient, thoughtful. He had courted her for 14 months before proposing, and the ring he chose was a simple oval diamond that matched, somehow, exactly what she would have picked herself. It was only much later that she understood how precisely he had studied her. The paramedics were gone by 9 in the morning. Claire arrived by noon, driving up from Williamsburg with red eyes and a casserole dish wrapped in foil, and Margaret let her daughter hold her in the front hallway for a long time without saying anything. Claire was 38, with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she had inherited what Margaret privately called the Caldwell capacity for crisis management, the ability to make phone calls, coordinate logistics, and reorganize a kitchen cabinet when the world was falling apart. "I'll take care of the arrangements," Claire said, already pulling her phone from her pocket. "I know you will, Margaret Said." That night, after Claire had gone home to her husband and her children, Margaret sat alone in Thomas's study for the first time in years. He had always kept it locked, not aggressively, not with any dramatic prohibition, but with the quiet insistence of a man who valued his privacy. "My thinking room," he had called it. She had accepted that, the way she had accepted so many things over the years, with the polite deference of a woman who had been taught that a good marriage required space. The key was on his nightstand. She had placed it there herself after the paramedics left. She sat in his leather chair, the smell of him still sharp in the room. Cedar and something faintly chemical she had never been able to identify, and looked at the rows of file folders stacked neatly on the shelves. His desk was clean. As always, a single legal pad, a pen, a framed photograph of the two of them at their 20th anniversary dinner. She picked up the photograph and studied his face. Who were you? The thought came without warning, and it startled her, not because it was strange, but because it was not. Because somewhere in the deepest, most honest part of herself, Margaret Caldwell realized she had been asking that question for years. She told herself she was simply organizing. That was how she justified it to herself. In those first days after Thomas's death, she was a practical woman, a woman of lists and systems, and there were things that needed to be done. Insurance policies to locate, bank accounts to inventory, a will to be filed with a probate court. Organizing Thomas's study was simply the responsible thing to do, the kind of task that prevented complications later. She started with the obvious, the filing cabinet behind the desk, the one with the small brass lock that Thomas had always kept secured. The spare key was taped to the underside of the bottom drawer, a hiding place so elementary that Margaret found it in under 10 minutes and felt a strange pang when she did, as though the simplicity of it was its own kind of insult. The first drawer held what she expected: financial records, tax returns going back 15 years, a folder labeled property that contained the deed to the house. The second drawer held insurance documents, a copy of Thomas's will, and a manila envelope labeled personal in his small, precise handwriting. Inside the envelope, she found two things that stopped her breathing. The first was a Virginia driver's license, not expired, not current, but from 1987, bearing Thomas's photograph but a different name. The man in the photograph was unmistakably her husband, young and sharp-featured, with the same dark eyes she had looked into across the breakfast table for 31 years. But the name printed beneath the photograph was not Thomas Howard Caldwell. It was Robert Daniel Sims. Date of birth, March 14, 1956. Address, Charlotte, North Carolina. Margaret sat with the license in her hands for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the study floor. Somewhere outside, a cardinal was singing in the magnolia tree. The second item in the envelope was a photograph, a Polaroid. The colors faded to that particular amber tone of the late 1980s. In it, a younger Thomas Robert stood beside a woman Margaret had never seen, his arm around her waist, both of them squinting into summer sunlight. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was not Thomas's, were 4 words: Charlotte, 1988. Our last summer. She put everything back in the envelope. She placed the envelope in the top drawer of her own dresser, under a stack of winter sweaters. Then she walked downstairs, stood at the kitchen sink, and washed her hands 3 times with the lemon dish soap Thomas had always insisted on buying, even though she preferred the unscented kind. It was her friend Dorothy Nugent who noticed something was wrong. Dorothy had been Margaret's closest friend for 22 years. They had met at a garden club meeting at Louis Ginter Botanical Garden, bonded over a shared contempt for ornamental kale, and had been inseparable since. Dorothy was 61, Vietnamese-American, with silver hair cut in a blunt bob and the directness of a woman who had survived 2 recessions, 1 divorce, and a flood, took her first home. She arrived on Thursday morning with Vietnamese coffee and pastries from a bakery on Carey Street, and she took one look at Margaret's face and set down the bag without a word. "Tell me," Dorothy said. Margaret told her about the license, about the photograph. About the name Robert Daniel Sims. Dorothy listened without interrupting, a rare thing and a gift. When Margaret finished, Dorothy was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee with a small spoon. "Have you looked him up?" Dorothy asked. "I don't know how to start." "I do," Dorothy said. They spent the afternoon on Margaret's laptop at the kitchen table. Dorothy navigating with the focused efficiency of someone who had taught herself to file her own taxes online at 60 and had never looked back. What they found in those hours unfolded slowly, like water damage revealing itself in layers. First a discoloration, then a stain, then the full rot beneath the surface. Robert Daniel Sims had existed. He had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the son of a furniture salesman and a school teacher. He had attended the University of North Carolina at Charlotte for 2 years before dropping out. He had been arrested in 1989 on charges of wire fraud related to a small investment scheme, a case that had been settled out of court, the records partially sealed but not entirely invisible to someone who knew where to look. And then, in 1991, Robert Daniel Sims had simply ceased to exist. No further tax records, no further addresses, no further history. Thomas Howard Caldwell, meanwhile, had first appeared in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1992 with a Social Security number, a credit history, and a resume that positioned him as a financial consultant with a decade of experience. "He built a new life," Dorothy said quietly. "He built it on lies." Margaret sighed. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. What followed in the next 2 weeks was a slow and terrible education. Margaret hired an attorney, James Whitfield, a quiet, careful man from a firm on East Main Street whom Dorothy had used during her divorce, and together they began to map the true shape of Thomas Caldwell's financial life. What they found was not chaos. It was worse than chaos. It was precision. It was the architecture of a man who had been managing deceptions with professional care for decades. The house on Monument Avenue, which Margaret had believed was fully paid off, carried a second mortgage Thomas had taken out in 2019 without her knowledge. The balance was $187,000. 2 of their joint investment accounts Margaret had seen the statements for every quarter. The statements Thomas had always handed her with a reassuring commentary had been quietly, systematically drained over 6 years, the money redirected to an account she had never known existed, registered to a shell company with a Richmond address. The amount missing from those accounts was $340,000. There was also a storage unit, rented under his real name, Robert Sims, at a facility off West Broad Street. Claire came with her when Margaret drove out there on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Both of them quiet in the car, the windshield wipers keeping a slow, steady rhythm. Inside the unit, they found boxers, financial records, meticulously organized, a second laptop, password protected, and in a grey metal lockbox, a collection of documents that made James Whitfield, when Margaret brought them to his office the following morning, sit back in his chair and remove his glasses and press his fingers to his eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said carefully, "I need you to prepare yourself." "I've been preparing myself," Margaret said, "for 31 years. There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in ordinary language. The grief of realizing that the life you mourned was not the life you actually lived. That the loss you are processing is not simply the loss of a person, but the loss of an entire version of yourself. The woman who had believed, the woman who had trusted, the woman who had, again and again, explained away the small wrongnesses because the alternative explanation was too large to hold. Margaret began to see it everywhere now, the shape of the lie, the way it had been constructed around her so carefully that she had mistaken the walls for the world. She remembered the way Thomas had always handled their finances personally, gently redirecting any attempt she made to engage more deeply with their accounts. "You trust me, don't you?" he would say, not unkindly, with that particular smile that had always made her feel the question was rhetorical. She did trust him. She had trusted him completely, and each time she accepted his redirection, She had not thought of it as yielding ground. She had thought of it as being a good partner. She remembered how he had discouraged her over the years from maintaining her own friendships too deeply. Not with prohibitions. Thomas had never been crude enough for prohibitions. He had been subtler than that. A comment about Dorothy delivered with mild concern. She seems a little unstable, don't you think? After the divorce, a suggestion that her book club was taking up time she might prefer to spend differently, a habit of scheduling dinners for two on the evenings she had planned to see friends, so that cancelling became the loving choice, the wifely choice, and she had made it over and over, feeling generous rather than diminished. She had a word for it now. James Whitfield had not used the word, but the counselor Dorothy helped her find a woman named Patricia Ellis who worked from an office in the museum district and specialized in exactly this kind of aftermath. Used it in their second session, quietly and without drama, and Margaret had sat with it for a long time before she could say it aloud herself. Coercive control. It doesn't require violence, Patricia sighed. In fact, it often works better without it. The goal is to make the other person smaller, gradually, so they don't notice it happening, so they mistake their diminishment for contentment. I thought I was content, Margaret said. I know, Patricia said. That's the design. Claire took the news in stages, the way young people sometimes do, first the practical crisis, then the emotional one. When Margaret told her the full extent of what Thomas had done, Claire sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold, and her face moved through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something that looked like controlled fury. He stole from you, Claire said. Yes. 4 years. Yes. And the identity, the real name. Did you ever suspect anything? Margaret considered the question honestly. There had been moments. A night, years ago, when she had found Thomas in the study very late, speaking quietly on the phone, and when she had knocked and asked who he was talking to, he had said a client in Seattle with a smoothness that should have troubled her more than it did. A time when she had mentioned, casually, that she was thinking of having some old photographs scanned and organized, and the brief flicker across his face there and gone in an instant that she had interpreted at the time as mild disdain. A birthday, his 65th, when she had tried to track down an old friend from his past to invite as a surprise, and every trail she followed had led nowhere, and Thomas, when she mentioned it, had laughed and said he had simply never been good at staying in touch. She had believed all of it. I believed all of it, she told Claire. Mom? Claire's voice broke. That is not your fault. James Whitfield had filed the necessary paperwork to freeze the remaining assets and open a full accounting of the estate. The shell company Thomas had used to siphon the investment funds was registered in Delaware, a common enough structure for legitimate businesses, Whitfield explained, but in this case used to obscure the movement of money with practiced expertise. Following the money trail backward through several years of transactions revealed what appeared to be a pattern of quiet money shifted between accounts, invested in ventures that existed primarily on paper, generating returns that were documented but never verified. There was, Whitfield told her carefully, a possibility that some of the money could be recovered. There was also a possibility that other creditors would come forward, people or institutions. Thomas had defrauded before becoming Thomas. Robert Sims's 1989 wire fraud case had been settled, technically, but the individual who had brought the original complaint, a man named Gerald Fowler of Charlotte, North Carolina, was still alive and, upon being contacted by Whitfield's office, had expressed significant interest in the discovery that Robert Sims had been living in Virginia for 30 years under an assumed name. Margaret was sitting in her garden when Whitfield called to tell her about Gerald Fowler. It was a warm evening in late May, the roses she had been tending for 20 years climbing the garden wall in full bloom, the air sweet and heavy in the particular way of Richmond evenings in early summer. She had a glass of iced tea and a book she had not been reading, open face down in her lap. She thought about the woman who had planted those roses, 32 years old, newly married, believing she was building something real and permanent, pressing each baroot cane into the Virginia clay with her own hands. "Mrs. Caldwell," Whitfield said. "Are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'm still here." The full picture took 4 months to assemble. It was not, in the end, a simple story. Margaret had been hoping, somewhere in the private part of herself that still craved resolution, that the truth would arrive as a single clean revelation, one clear answer that would organize all the disorder and make sense of 31 years. Instead, it arrived the way real truth usually does, in pieces, incomplete and contradictory, requiring her to hold multiple versions of a person simultaneously and accept that none of them was the whole. The second laptop, recovered from the storage unit and unlocked by a forensic technology service Whitfield retained, contained what amounted to a personal archive: emails, documents, scanned records going back to the early 1990s. It painted a portrait of a man who had made a decision in 1991, at 35 years old, facing a fraud conviction that would have followed him everywhere, to simply disappear and become someone else. It was not, by the standards of elaborate criminal enterprise, a sophisticated operation. It was the work of a moderately intelligent, deeply frightened man who had access to the right resources at the right moment in history, before the digital record-keeping that now made such reinventions nearly impossible. There had been a woman in Charlotte. Her name was Susan Mercer. She was the woman in the Polaroid photograph. They had lived together for 3 years, had never married, and had separated before Thomas's reinvention, though the separation had not, Marga learned, been entirely voluntary on Susan's part. Susan Mercer, now 67, and living in Asheville, North Carolina, had spent 2 years in the mid-1990s looking for Robert Sims, filing missing person reports that went nowhere, convinced something terrible had happened to him. She had eventually stopped looking, eventually rebuilt her life. Eventually, as she told Margaret in a phone call that both of them found necessary and devastating, stopped being angry and simply became sad. "I thought he was dead," Susan said. Her voice was quiet and careful, the voice of a woman who had long since made peace with something she could not change. "I mourned him. I actually mourned him." "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "Don't be sorry, you didn't know. Neither did you." The financial reckoning continued through June and into July. The second mortgage on the house was a genuine liability. The bank had a legitimate claim, and there was no legal argument against it. The investment account funds, however, represented a different matter. Whitfield believed a significant portion could be recovered through the estate. The shell company's assets were frozen, and while the full amount was unlikely to be returned, a recovery of 60 to 70% was, in Whitfield's careful estimation, achievable. The Gerald Fowler matter was more complicated. Fowler, who was 72 and had retired from a hardware business in Charlotte, had lost $40,000 in 1989 to Robert Sims's investment scheme, money he had been saving to start his own business, money that had set back his plans by nearly a decade. The statute of limitations on the original fraud had long expired, and any civil claim would face significant challenges. But Fowler was not. It turned out interested primarily in money. "I just wanted to know," he told Margaret, through Whitfield's office, in a message that was passed along with careful professional neutrality. "I always wanted to know what happened to him. Whether he just kept doing it to other people." Margaret thought about that for a long time. Whether Thomas had kept doing it to other people. There was evidence of smaller schemes. A former business partner in Raleigh who had filed a civil complaint in 2003 that had been settled confidentially, the term sealed. A consulting client in the mid-2000s who had complained to the Virginia Department of Financial Institutions and then, inexplicably, withdrawn the complaint 3 weeks later. Whether those withdrawals had been genuine changes of heart or something else, the quiet application of pressure, financial or otherwise, was something Whitfield said would be very difficult to prove. What was provable, and what Margaret came to understand in those long summer months of documents and depositions and meetings in quiet offices on East Main Street, was this: Thomas Howard Caldwell had been, from the very beginning, a man who used other people as instruments. Not out of malice, or not primarily out of malice, but out of a particular species of coldness that had never allowed him to see the people in his life as fully real, as fully human, as people whose grief, when it came, would be genuine and lasting and undeserved. The hardest day was not the day she found the driver's license. It was not the day Whitfield told her about the second mortgage, or the day she spoke to Susan Mercer on the phone. The hardest day was an ordinary Saturday in August, when Margaret was working in her garden in the late morning heat, and she found, tucked behind the ceramic pot she had placed near the back fence decades ago, a small, smooth stone. She had given it to Thomas on their 5th anniversary, a river stone she had found during a walk along the James River, which she had thought looked like a heart, or close enough to one. She had given it to him as a joke, mostly, and he had laughed and put it in his pocket, and she had entirely forgotten about it. It had kept Italiano for 26 years. He had kept it. She held the stone in her palm for a long time. There in the August heat, sweat at her temples and dirt on her knees, she did not know what the stone meant. She could not decide whether it meant anything at all, or whether she simply wanted it to. Because the alternative was that nothing had meant anything was more than she was willing to believe. She put the stone in her pocket. She kept guarding. That afternoon, she called Dorothy. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay," Dorothy said. "I'm angry," Margaret said. "I'm not sad anymore. I'm angry." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good," she said. "It's about time." The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in mid-September at the Richmond Circuit Court, a stately building on North 9th Street where the Virginia state flag hung in the lobby and the floors were worn smoothed by a century of footsteps. Margaret wore a navy dress and the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and she sat beside James Whitfield at a polished table and listened as the financial details of her marriage were laid out in legal language, clear and impersonal, like a diagnosis delivered by a doctor who has seen this particular illness many times before. The estate settlement was approved. The recovery from the shell company accounts amounted to 62% of the missing funds, $210,800, returned to Margaret's name. The second mortgage would be paid from the estate, leaving the house on Monument Avenue with equity reduced but intact. She would not be wealthy. She would not be ruined. She would be in the particular financial middle ground that Whitfield had been aiming for all along. Stable. Claire sat behind her in the gallery. Dorothy sat beside Claire. Patricia Ellis, who had offered to come, was there in the back row in a quiet gray blazer, her presence alone a comfort. Walking out of the courthouse into the September morning, the air finally cooling, the sky a deep, clear blue over the James River, Margaret stopped on the steps and stood still for a moment, letting the sunlight fall on her face. Claire came to stand beside her. Dorothy appeared on her other side. No one said anything for a while, and that silence felt, to Margaret, like something she had earned. "What now?" Claire asked finally. "Now I go home," Margaret sighed, "and I plant the fall bulbs." It was not a deflection. It was, Margaret had come to understand over those long months, one of the truest things she could say. The garden had been hers in a way the marriage, she now recognized, had never quite been. It was the one domain Thomas had shown no interest in controlling, perhaps because it offered him nothing useful, or perhaps because watching her tend it had served some purpose she preferred not to examine. Either way, the garden had been hers. The roses were hers. The Virginia clay she had turned and amended and enriched over 25 years of careful tending was hers, shaped by her own hands into something that grew despite everything. The months that followed were not easy. She would not pretend they were. There were nights when the anger broke open into something raw, a grief not for Thomas specifically, but for the version of herself she was now required to release. The woman who had trusted completely. The woman who had believed that the life she was living was the life she was actually in. That woman had been real. Her love, even if it had been love for someone who did not exist, had been real. And mourning something real is real mourning. regardless of what it was morning. Patricia Ellis gave her tools for those nights, not prescriptions, not easy formulas, but genuine instruments for navigating the kind of loss that does not have a clean shape. They talked about the difference between trust and naivety, about the ways intelligent, capable women are systematically trained to interpret their own discomfort as a personal failing rather than as accurate information, about the particular vulnerability of women who come of age in a generation that still, despite everything, taught them that a good marriage required a certain amount of looking away. You weren't foolish, Patricia told her, Moreta Nonce. You were targeted by someone who was very good at what he did. Margaret believed her. It took time to believe her, but she did. She began, cautiously, to rebuild the shape of her daily life. She rejoined the garden club at Lewiskin, showing up to a Saturday morning meeting with a flat of late-season asters and a willingness to simply be present without explanation. She had lunch with Dorothy every Tuesday at a Vietnamese restaurant on Carey Street, where Dorothy always ordered the pho and Margaret always ordered the lemongrass chicken, and neither of them ever felt obligated to talk about anything they didn't want to talk about. She drove to Williamsburg twice a month to spend weekends with Claire and her grandchildren, 2 boys, 6 and 8, with their mother's stubbornness and their grandfather's eyes, though Margaret was working, gently and deliberately, on reframing what she meant when she thought about those eyes. She took a class. This was Dorothy's idea, and Margaret resisted it for longer than she should have. A personal finance course offered through the Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Richmond. Held on Monday evenings in a classroom that smelled of chalk and carpet cleaner and the particular hopefulness of people who have decided it is not too late to learn something new. She was not the oldest person in the room. She was not the newest to the subject. She was simply a woman of 63 who had decided, with a precision that felt like reclaiming something stolen, to understand the numbers that governed her own life. By November, she could read a financial statement without assistance. By December, she had opened her own investment account for the first time in her adult life, small but entirely her own, managed by her own decisions. She carried the Riverstone in her pocket every day. She was still deciding what it meant, or whether it needed to mean anything. Some days she thought it was simply a stone. Some days she thought it was evidence that human beings are so much more than their worst decisions, that something real can exist inside a person who is also capable of profound cruelty, and that acknowledging this complexity is not the same as forgiving it. Some days she thought it was a reminder not of Thomas, not exactly, but of the woman who had stood on the bank of the James River 26 years ago and picked up a stone because it reminded her of a heart. That woman was still here. She had been here the whole time, underneath everything. The magnolias on Monument Avenue had long since lost their spring blossoms by that December, their broad leaves turning to the waxy dark green of winter. Margaret stood on the porch one morning, her coffee warming her hands. Real coffee now, not chamomile. She had gone back to real coffee and was not apologizing for it, and watched a light frost glaze the garden. The roses had been cut back for winter, the beds mulched and put to sleep. Beneath the cold ground, the bulbs she had planted in September were waiting. She was not the woman she had been the morning Thomas died. She was not the woman she had been the morning she married him, or the morning she found the driver's license, or the morning she walked out of the Richmond Circuit Court into the September sun. She was someone newer and older, and, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, entirely her own. She thought about Gerald Fowler in Charlotte, who had simply wanted to know. She thought about Susan Mercer in Asheville, who had mourned a man who had never deserved it. She thought about the version of herself that had explained away 100 small wrongnesses over 31 years, and she extended that version of herself the same thing Patricia Ellis had spent months teaching her to offer: not excusing, not forgetting, but the only thing that ever actually sets a person free. She finished her coffee. She went back inside. She had a Monday evening class to prepare for, a phone call with Claire to make, and a garden that would need her attention again in spring. She was 63 years old, and she was just beginning.